Hello there, welcome to another video, and if you're new here, welcome to my channel. I want to share about something that happened to me recently. I wanted to share this personal experience because I think it's a good example of how it is to cope with having dissociated parts and what it can look like as you start healing. It involves topics of emotional neglect and self-harm, so if any of those topics could be triggering to you, feel free to click off the video, and I'll do more videos later without triggering content involved. Emotional neglect and attachment trauma can cause dissociated parts because children need help regulating their own emotions. And if kids don't have help regulating their own emotions, the emotions can be very overwhelming to a child if they don't get help from caretakers. Oftentimes this can lead to dissociation because the psyche feels the need to dissociate away the emotional content so it's not overwhelming, and so you can continue living. Emotional neglect and abuse can also be dissociated off in order to help the child be able to still try to connect to caregivers, because kids still need their caregivers for survival. So if there's an instance where the caregiver is very much not there for them, it can be beneficial to just dissociate awareness of that event so they can still try to see the caregiver as somebody who will protect them. So the other morning I woke up and there was a dissociated child part that also woke up alongside me. This can start to happen more when you start to feel safer, because then your psyche feels safe enough to start sharing these experiences with you. So it's actually a sign of healing, even though it can be very overwhelming and hard to deal with. I woke up alongside this child part, and because we were so blended together, I started experiencing flashbacks to the event that had made them dissociate off. When parts dissociate off, sometimes they can just be stuck in an event, in a memory, and they feel like they're still there and like it's still happening because they got dissociated off at the time, so there's never a resolution for it for them. I was blended with this part that still felt as if we were about 4 years old, and because the dissociative barriers were lower, I also felt as if I was 4 years old and was experiencing that event again, even though at the same time I was able to watch inside my head from my more adult perspective. I'll share what this dissociated part was going through, and then I'll share with how my system and I dealt with it. So when I first woke up and I was blended with them, I could instantly tell because I was feeling all of their emotions that had previously been dissociated. I got connected to their experience and I saw what trauma they had gone through that made them dissociate off. So I'll share a little bit about what happened to them, to me, so you can have an idea of what kind of things can cause parts to dissociate off. Sometimes it's just an absence of love and care and attachment and support that can cause dissociation. Even though times like this are hard, I'm grateful for them because it can help you to become more aware of what dissociated parts you're dealing with. So I lived with my mom, my dad, my brother, and me. And this one day when I was about 4 years old, my mom and my twin brother left the house to go into the city and left me alone at home with my dad. And I'm not going to share too much about my dad, but he was not nurturing, and I didn't feel emotionally supported by him at all. I didn't feel I could go to him when I was in distress. So I was just in my room, just crying and crying. I remember I was just distraught that I had been left, that my mom had taken my brother and left, and I had been left alone. And my dad was in the house, but I still felt like I was alone because I didn't see him as a support. and he didn't help me. So I was in my room just crying and crying, feeling abandoned and alone and uncared for. And as a little kid around 4, you don't have the ability to regulate your own emotions. So I got into this state of just being extremely emotional and upset, and I wasn't able to regulate myself and get out of it without caretaker support. This is very overwhelming to a child. It can be extremely scary and overwhelming when they feel these big, strong emotions. And it can feel almost like life and death when the trauma involved is a lack of caregiving, because kids need the caregivers to survive. So it really does feel like a life and death situation to a kid. My dad was somewhere else in the house, and he didn't come help me. I was just alone in my room for hours, and he didn't check on me. I don't even know if he knew I was crying. He just didn't care. After hours and hours of crying and not being able to regulate my emotions and being alone, this was just an extremely traumatic emotional state. And my psyche actually helped me out. Psychosis, it can be a coping skill, and it can be a way to help with trauma. So after hours of crying, I started hallucinating. I hallucinated a conversation coming through the wall. I thought that I heard my dad call my mom on the phone and say to her, you know, Kimjo's really upset. You need to come home and help them. Like, they're just really upset and they need you here, so come home. And when I heard that conversation through the wall, it helped me feel a lot better, because I felt that my dad was aware of the emotional state that I was in, and I felt that he was trying to help me, even though he was emotionally limited himself and he wasn't coming into my room to help me personally. I still felt that he was trying to help me by calling my mom and asking her to come take care of me. And that gave me the feeling that I was, in a way, being cared for and supported, which is what I needed in that moment. I also believed then that my mom was coming home to take care of me, so that offered a big comfort to me in the moment. I don't really remember what happened after that, but then I remember later when my mom came home, I think I just been crying the whole time, or maybe I just went to sleep. I'm not really sure. It's kind of hard with dissociation sometimes to have a full linear memory. But when my mom came home later, she seemed to not be aware that I had been crying all day or that I needed help. So I asked her, "Did Dad call you?" And she said no. So I was just very confused by that, because I had heard the conversation through the phone and realized later that it hadn't happened. Now I know that I have psychosis and I hallucinate, so I'm able to explain that, but as a kid I just kind of felt like I was losing my mind. I didn't know why I'd experienced this thing happening that didn't actually happen. Overall, this event, it was extremely traumatic as a child, because basically the lesson that I learned was that my caretakers weren't going to support me, and I could be crying alone in my room all day and nobody would even know or care. I basically had been abandoned by my caretakers. And like I said, that's really traumatic for a little kid. So then this little child part just dissociated off into my psyche and became disconnected from me. I'd forgotten about this until this little child part woke up with me that day and started sharing all of this with me, and I started experiencing it alongside them. Experiencing all these emotions and this abandonment, it was really difficult for me even as an adult in the present. I was getting sucked into the little kid's experience in flashbacks, and it was really hard for me to stay grounded in my adult self. So At some points, I would just be fully experiencing it along with them. I would be just crying. I was just in my room crying for hours and hours, just like had happened when I was a little kid. And then at other certain points, I was able to get more distance from the part that was experiencing all of these emotions. And from my adult perspective in my head, I was suggesting healthy coping skills for the little kid to do to try to feel better. I was trying to tell them, like, wrap yourself up in a blanket, maybe draw a picture or cuddle with a stuffed animal, just something to help them feel better. This little kid was just inconsolable, though. I couldn't get them to do anything. Any of my suggestions just fell flat. All they could do was just sit and cry and remember this event and feel these feelings. It was sort of my initial reaction to get frustrated. In my adult self, I got frustrated at the child because they weren't listening to my advice on things they could do to help. And I've realized since that this reaction mirrors how my parents used to respond to emotions. When I would be very emotional as a kid, they would get angry at me. So it makes sense that I had this sort of instinctual reaction to this child part feeling these emotions, because that wasn't safe for me to feel when I was a kid. I was trying to just get it to stop because I still didn't feel that it was safe. At this point, my protector part, one of my protector parts, Winter, started getting involved because he could tell that this little kid part was having a really hard time and that I was having a really hard time feeling the emotions alongside the little kid part. When you don't learn emotional regulation as a child, it can be hard as an adult even to regulate your emotions, and that's still a process I'm working on learning how to do better. So my protector part, Winter, started trying to intervene, and he started suggesting self-harming to get the little kid part to dissociate off again, so I wouldn't be so overwhelmed by the emotions. Dissociation makes all of these things easier to cope with in a way, and the path towards healing involves less dissociation, and so the emotions can come up more, and that's really difficult. So Winter was suggesting self-harming, a bunch of different self-harming methods, and I was trying to avoid self-harming because I haven't done that in a really long time, and I didn't want to relapse. So I was doing my best to just try to sit with the emotions that the little kid part was experiencing, and once they wouldn't really listen to my suggestions, and I realized, okay, so they're just going to be feeling their feelings, and that's all they can do right now, I started just trying to accept and feel the feelings alongside them. In that way, it was sort of like I was supporting them through it because I was able to be an adult there for them as a child in that moment. We were just crying for hours, and eventually it got too overwhelming for me, and I ended up getting dissociated. So I lost time for a few hours, and I don't really remember what happened at that point. I know that my protector part, Winter, ended up self-harming, so unfortunately that was a relapse, but I still feel strong in my recovery for self-harm because even though Winter self-harmed, it actually didn't really help at all. In the past, it would strengthen the dissociative barriers, so the emotions weren't so overwhelming. But in this instance, it didn't make the emotions go away. It didn't make this emotional part dissociate off again. They were still there feeling their feelings, and I was still connected to them. This was kind of a good learning experience because we realized that self-harming doesn't work for us anymore. Now that we're more recovered and more integrated, we can't just dissociate parts off so easily anymore with self-harm. It didn't really have any positive coping effect. So that was a good experience because since then, in times when I've been overwhelmed, we haven't wanted to self-harm because we have realized that it doesn't really work for us anymore. I did eventually get reconnected as my adult self, and the child part was still there, still feeling their feelings, so I was still there alongside them. And after Winter had self-harmed and that hadn't helped the situation, I accepted that I would just have to sit with this part and with these feelings and just feel it all, even though the flashbacks were really overwhelming. I did my best to just sit with it, and that's something I've been practicing a lot in recovery over the years, just practicing sitting with emotions. I sat with this little kid part and tried to comfort them and basically tried to provide for them the support that we didn't get when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I wasn't supported, and that's what led to this traumatic event, and lack of support is what caused that part to disconnect. So even though we didn't have anybody to support us in the past, I'm able to support them now. That was actually a really good feeling. I'm able to be a supportive person for myself, and I'm able to provide the love and care and nurturing for the little kid parts that they needed but didn't get when we were younger. Even though I did relapse in the self-harm momentarily, I feel that overall this was a very positive experience. I was able to sit with the emotions and support this little kid part, and after just feeling the emotions, being allowed to feel them and being supported, they actually felt a lot better, and I actually felt a lot better too after this event. I feel like it allowed me to process a lot of grief that had been dissociated away that I wasn't consciously experiencing. And because the dissociative barriers got lower and I did get so blended with this part, I was able to actually feel and process that event. I was able to come more to terms with the fact that my caretakers really let me down and really weren't supportive of me in the way that I needed. And it showed me how clearly lack of support can lead to parts dissociating off. So I just wanted to share this experience because I feel like it's a good example of how it can be to live with having dissociated parts in dissociative identity disorder or even in CPTSD. It can be really hard to get more connected to dissociated parts because it causes you to have to come to terms with the emotions and experiences that caused them to dissociate off in the first place. But it's good to remember now that you're older and you are more capable of handling these emotions now. Now I know I can take care of myself and I don't need a caretaker to take care of me. I can be the caretaker for myself now, so that's really empowering. I'm glad that my psyche felt able to share this with me and felt able to let me get more connected with this part. It's a good sign for recovery that I was able to feel this grief and process it on a really real emotional level. As you go through recovery and as you start processing your traumas and as you start learning to feel safer, then more grief is able to come up. I'm glad that I had my system of parts to help me through it. It was useful that Winter was there supporting me. Even if he had some suggestions that weren't the healthiest, it was good to not feel alone in the situation. And I'm grateful for the dissociation still because that allowed me to be able to step back and still have my adult perspective and be able to support this child part the way that they needed. So that's an example of how having a system can really help you to shoulder trauma together and provide a support system for each other and for yourself overall. I'm really grateful to be able to start processing this grief more because that'll really help me moving forward in the future if I'm able to process some of this grief. Grief can really weigh you down, and once you process it, you just feel a lot lighter and a lot better. So I'm really grateful that I'm in a safe enough place to start doing that processing now. So I just wanted to share that experience in case anybody can relate. If you have any of these issues yourself, or if you have a loved one going through similar, I hope this can provide some support and insight into how it is for other people dealing with these things. If you deal with this sort of stuff too, know that you're not alone. If anybody watching this video has any similar experiences or advice on what they've done to cope with getting more connected to other parts, that would be really great if you would like to share about that in the comments. So thank you very much for watching and for listening to my story. I hope it was helpful in some way, and I'll see you around in the next video. Take care.